From the Gospel of Luke, chapter 13, verses 31 through 35. At that very hour, some Pharisees came and said to him, "Get away from here, for Herod wants to kill you." He said to them, "Go and tell that fox for me, 'Listen, I am casting out demons and performing cures today and tomorrow, and on the third day I finish my work. Yet today, tomorrow, and the next day I must be on my way, because it is impossible for a prophet to be killed outside of Jerusalem. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often I had desired to gather your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing. See, your house is left to you, and I tell you, you will not see me until the time comes when you say, 'Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord.'" May God add a blessing to the reading and the hearing of these holy words. And the people of God said, Amen.
Friends, do you have a favorite book? A book that got inside of you, maybe changed the way you see the world, see yourself? Do you have such a book? I hope some of you might say the Bible would be a book like that, but I'm thinking of other kinds of literature. A story that perhaps, again, maybe a grandmother or a parent, maybe somebody in school introduced you to. In my life, that happened somewhere when I was fairly young. In 1977, HarperCollins published a children's book. I probably was introduced to it somewhere thereafter. Illustrator James Stevenson. The book's title, a bit about this resource. The book's title is "Could Be Worse." In the story, two grandchildren complain to their grandfather, their grandpa, about all sorts of everyday difficulties. A splinter, a lost kite, there was a flat tire on the bike. And to each challenge, Grandpa states, "Could be worse." The children, of course, are unimpressed. There's a fun twist to the story I'm going to let you discover if you'd like. You can get online and either order this book, go to the library. YouTube, I think, has actually, you can just listen to it if you care to do that. It's that refrain, Grandpa's refrain, however, that got lodged in my elementary school brain, and it surfaces from time to time. Could be worse. Now, while true in most scenarios, I'm finding that response provides little comfort when life's difficulties grow beyond splinters and flat tires. It is not terribly helpful to tell people in dire circumstances it could be worse. As a matter of fact, in saying so, what I hear is an avoidance, perhaps even a denial of reality in the could be worse, that seeks to ignore pain by pointing to an even greater form of suffering. Yeah, you've got it bad, but it could be even worse. Friends, instead of imagining an even worse case scenario or trying to one-up another's pain with such a phrase, a pastor friend of mine described it as almost as if we have a grief Olympics. Right? You tell me something bad, and I say, well, it could be worse. And then we launch into whatever worst thing maybe we've experienced. I'm wondering when and how we deal with the pain we feel and the grief that we bear, and maybe we might do that in a more constructive way. This series, Being Human, is meant to draw us into coming face to face with our mortality. That's what Lent generally is about. That we're just going to strip away all of the excuses, all of the pretending, all of the hiding, and we're just going to name difficulty for what it is. If we seek health and wholeness, some call this shalom or peace, then perhaps what I want to suggest today is we can start by recognizing our grief. Maybe we start by simply giving ourselves permission to name our losses. This is one way to understand grief, one way that I'm suggesting we could understand grief, an emotional response to loss. Have you lost anything in your life? We know that an emotional response often does manifest itself as a physical response. We get sick, we shed tears, we scream, we shout. These are all physical expressions of something we experience emotionally. Could we give ourselves permission to experience it? Because sometimes we bury our pain. We tell ourselves or have others tell us it could be worse. And the loss gets pushed down or pushed aside and never dealt with. And in my experience, when that happens, that loss festers. It can kill us. But again, what if we start doing the hard thing and we name our loss, we recognize our grief? What if we start recognizing that some of us are experiencing hardship in this moment, this day? We've lost jobs or opportunities. We've lost friendships. We've lost church members here at this very congregation on how best to live out our faith. We find ourselves cut off from family and coworkers about racial justice, policing reform, military intervention around the world. Politics have become hyper-partisan, and polarization is simply accepted as the norm. Many of us have stopped talking to people in our lives, our family, and our friends because we know that it just turns into a debate, and then that debate turns into an argument, and then nobody hears one another. We can't even talk to those people who think differently than us because we just can't understand how could they possibly think the way they think. I'm not the only one experiencing this, am I? And so we lose connection, and our relationships suffer. And what comes out is anger or frustration and fear and sadness, I want to suggest to us, is perhaps rooted in our grief. We don't know how to express that in a way that allows us to remain connected. So we separate ourselves from ourselves and from others, from God. So I'm suggesting let's just name our grief. Let's dig below the surface and find the root of our concern. Let us voice our complaints. Hear me on this. Voice our complaints. This is not the same as going on social media and railing about whatever. Can you hear me in this? I want to suggest that is one way of voicing a complaint. But I want to suggest to you there might be more helpful ways, because when you just scream into the void of social media, again, I think what winds up happening is not a conversation, not healing. We just add fuel to our disassociation, our disconnection from others. Our friends, many of which who think differently than us, see the world differently than us, rail against us, and then, okay, now I got to block you, or now I got to delete you, or whatever. And again, you see what we become more and more distant. So we're going to voice our complaints. We're going to voice what we've lost or what we worry we might lose. And I want to suggest to you, friends, that is hard but important work. It is easier for most of us to just pretend like everything is okay. Put on a happy face. The very first little record I bought, is that a 45? Yeah, 33 is the big one, right? 45? Bobby McFerrin's Don't Worry, Be Happy. That's horrible advice. It's a catchy tune, and I really enjoy Bobby McFerrin, but that's horrible advice. Forget about it. Don't pay attention to it. Just go on and put on a smile. Don't worry, be happy. No. Kate Bowler, author, professor, who has offered a Lenten devotional called The Hardest Part. In that devotional, she says this: I'd like to make a strong case for complaint as a spiritual virtue. There is something cathartic, healing, when you don't have to eat it, but instead you can say, this did not go well. I am not pleased. Everyone needs to do better. Complaining allows us to see that the world is not as it should be. Complaining to God allows us to locate ourselves in a situation and figure out where God should be. When we say to God, I'm tired of being sick. I'm tired of people not listening to me. I'm angry that this is happening. Where are you? Then we might just find that God shows up in surprising ways. When a friend knows a friend, or when someone brings you dinner, or when the doctor finally listens. Your complaints might help you figure out the next right step, or just help you get it all out. Either way, God can handle your complaints. God will listen. So what are your complaints? What's your grief? Do you still need to process the miscarriage? Work through the divorce? Find a way to cope with being fired, or learn how to live without the husband, the wife, the father, the mother, the child? Do you need to face the diagnosis? Do your memories haunt you because you remember it was better then? Are you looking around, wishing for the way things used to be and how you wish they still were? About half the folks here this morning, maybe a little bit more, were here at a time in the life of this church when things were thriving. When the pews were filled. Can you remember those days? And some of you look around and you think, I wish we could go back to that. Right? That's your complaint, or one of your complaints. Things are not as they should be. So you grieve and because there's loss. So friends, we can bottle it up, we could stuff it down, we can tell ourselves and others, well, it could be worse. Or we can cry out. We can complain. Again, not merely airing grievances. We can seek God in the midst of our suffering. The complaining is to say, God, what are you doing? God, where are you? God, won't you help? In biblical terms, when we do that, when we cry out that way, we practice a form of prayer called lament. Writing in Tempered Resilience, author Todd Bolsinger, also a professor, shares the thoughts of Sung Cha Ra, who recognizes laments are prayers of petition arising out of need. But lament is not simply the presentation of a list of complaints, nor merely the expression of sadness over difficult circumstances. Lament in the Bible is a liturgical response to the reality of suffering, and here's where it changes from being airing grievances, and engages God in the context of pain and trouble. Where does our help come from? Our help comes from the Lord, right? That's the whole thing. That's what lament recognizes. But to go on, the hope of lament is that God would respond to human suffering, and that is wholeheartedly communicated through lament. It's not just to complain to God, but it's to say, God, do something about this. We cry out because we know we need help, and that the only one who can help is God. This is what we can see in our reading today from Luke. This is what Jesus is doing when he offers a lament over Jerusalem. The Pharisees come to warn Jesus that Herod is out to get him. We're not sure if you read this, you're not really sure, is it actually a warning? The Pharisees generally have not been very helpful. Are they actually trying to tip Jesus off here? Are they playing some game? We don't really know. What we do know is that Herod the Great did try to kill Jesus as an infant, and that now his son, this Herod Antipas, that's the Herod mentioned here, has recently had John the Baptist, Jesus' cousin, beheaded. Herods are not really generally fans of Jesus. You're kind of picking that up, right? So when the Pharisees come and say, you ought to get out of town, whether they mean it or not, it's a real threat. Jesus' response to that threat is to remain committed to the work of helping people. You see, Jesus will time and time again, when most of us would disengage, when most of us would run away, when most of us would say, fine, I'm out of here. You don't want my help? Fine, I'm done. Jesus says, I'm not leaving because there's work to be done. I've got to cast out the demons. I got to cure the illnesses. I'm not going anywhere. He stays engaged. But he also expresses his pain. You hear it in the complaint that comes next, the lament. Jerusalem, Jerusalem. I mean, you're the city that kills the prophets and stones those that are sent to it. Can't you see that I'm here to help you? How often have I desired to gather your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, right? It's this image of protection and shelter and provision. I want to help you so badly, Jesus is saying. And here you are threatening me. Here you are trying to kill me, right? I mean, and he ends it with this, I tell you, you're not going to see me until the time comes when you say, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Jerusalem is unwilling to accept Jesus. The very people, the very place that should be celebrating him doesn't. His life is under threat. But he persists. He does cast out the demons. He does cure their illness. And he does voice this pain, this suffering, this grief. They reject the good news coming from Jesus. Friends, sometimes you don't like the things I do. Right? You get sideways with the pastor. Have you ever been sideways with a pastor? I'm still pretty new, so we're still kind of in a honeymoon period, I think. At some point, you're not going to like me for something, right? The sermon was too long, or I didn't show up at the hospital, or I messed something up, right? Something's going to happen. What I need to do in those moments is to say, whatever I've messed up, I need to apologize for. I need to recognize my piece of that. But I also want to say this. I could be Jesus, and some of you will still complain about whatever we do. Because that's what they did to Jesus, right? The man walks on water. He's casting out demons. He's multiplying loaves and fishes. He's feeding the multitudes, right? He's literally bringing people back from the dead. And they say, we're going to kill you. Right? What hope do we mere pastors have? Back to Jesus, though. Jesus, in this moment, he says, I'm going to be about this work. It's the work that I've been called to do, and I'm going to do it. But he says in this complaint, things are not as they should be. There shouldn't be disease that I have to cure. There shouldn't be demons that I have to cast out. Things are not should be. Death is not supposed to win. It sounds like Jesus might be complaining about the people of Jerusalem. And we could easily read it that way. Perhaps he is. But because I recognize this as a lament, I think his complaint is ultimately directed to God. God, you sent me here. What are you doing? Where are you in the midst of this? I want to shelter and protect them, but even now they're plotting against me. I came to offer them life. God, what's up? What are you going to do about this? Where are you? Here's the thing, though, I want us to underline about this lament. He takes that complaint to God. And that expresses a level of faithfulness that I want to encourage in us. When bad things happen, when hard things happen, when life becomes difficult, this is the very time when we need to race to God. This is the very time when we need to invite God into the midst of our pain. God already knows what we're experiencing, but by voicing it to God, we're inviting God to participate in our healing. Can you hear me? Don't try to do it on your own. Don't try to go to a friend or a family member. There's not a way to work your way out of it. Right? These are the kinds of things we tend to do. Instead, pray. That's what I mean about voicing this complaint to God. Pray that God would do something. God would show up. God would make it clear what God is about. So in this moment, when Jesus could walk away, he doesn't. I'm going to keep this work. And although I'll leave town for a bit, I've got some more work to do. I'm coming back. I'm just thinking about this. I see my wife back in the back there. One of the things that Catherine and I have committed to, generally in our marriage, is that whatever happens between us, what we're going to do is we're going to stay together. Now, are there circumstances that could exist that would not make sense? Yes. But if it's an argument, if it's how we're going to pay the bills, if it's where we're going to live, the things that happen in marriages, how we're going to raise the kids, right? We're going to have differences about that. And what we're going to do is we're going to figure it out. We're going to work it out. We're going to say to each other, whatever else happens, we're going to stay together. We're going to figure it out. Right? In a world that values expediency and quick fixes, drive-through living, it's easy to discard or dismiss people we don't get along with, or we don't agree with, or we have difficulty with. Jesus shows us here a different way. They're threatening his life. They will kill him. And he says, but I'm not leaving you. I will never abandon you or forsake you. There is nothing that can separate us from the love of God through Jesus Christ. Can you hear that? Jesus refuses to abandon Jerusalem because he knows God has not given up on Jerusalem. He doesn't know, right? There's a question. God, what are you doing? But not knowing what God's doing is different than saying God's not doing anything. Because I don't understand, I'm going to say, God, help me understand. Show me, show up, help. So again, in this way, Jesus doesn't abandon Jerusalem because he knows God has not given up on Jerusalem. Jesus will not abandon us because God will not abandon us. Again, just to come back to Kate Bowler's idea on this, she shares that real comfort comes when instead of offering reasons or trite niceties, we practice presence in the face of difficulty, right? When we're dealing with grief and pain and loss, instead of saying, don't worry, be happy, or it could be worse, or, you're really handling it really well. You're going to learn something really great out of this. Right? We try to sugarcoat it. We try to silver lining it. You know what I'm talking about? That's well-intentioned, but it's not helpful, ultimately. So instead of doing that, practice presence. Be with one another as God is with us. That's what Jesus did. He came to be one with us in our human experience so that we could be one with him. Lament invites us into a place of truth-telling, love, and belonging. This is the opposite of division. This is the opposite of running away and avoiding each other. Truth-telling, love, belonging. Our complaints are voiced, and we're invited to sit in that pain together and to seek God in the midst of that suffering. Todd Bolsinger again puts it this way: laments are prayers that face the brutal facts of our world, the pain points of our lives, and the challenges of our callings, and it invites God right into the swirl of that disturbing moment as the one who is the primary and responsible actor during each crisis. Are you feeling the hardness of life today? Are you dealing with struggles and difficulties? Can you name the grief for what it is? And will you do the hard thing of sitting in the middle of it with God? Facing the brutal facts, recognizing the pain, and inviting God to do what God could do. God is the only one that can help. That could look like conversations we have with others. That could be the presence manifested through others. But ultimately, it's to say, God, what are you doing? Don't give up. Don't give in. Don't walk away. Don't avoid the hardness. I think, and that's the challenge I lift for us up at this leg of our Lenten journey, to identify those pain points in our lives, the difficulties and the obstacles. As we follow Jesus, that's what he does. And following Jesus is not about avoiding hard. It's about trusting God in the midst of it. Following Jesus in our daily life then allows us a chance to complain to God. If you haven't already done so, we've got some of these prayer ribbons. This is a great way to offer a complaint to God. Just write down whatever the grief is, whatever the pain is, whatever the difficulty is. And just leave it there. Give it to God in that way. This wilderness wandering is still before us. This is part of our preparation for Easter. To experience the true joy of resurrection, let us first come face to face with the difficulty of living this life. Yes? Pray with me. God, I confess that oftentimes when I think about following Jesus, when I consider what it is to be his apprentice, to do what he does, to live as he lives, I confess, God, that I think about all the new life that pops up. I think about all the joy and the celebration. I think about the sinner that's redeemed. I think about the prodigal that's welcomed home. And in that way, God, I think I've only focused on the joy without the suffering. I somehow want to skip over the death. So would you help us this season in particular? We marked ourselves with the ashes of the grave. We're struggling with naming and surrendering our temptations. Would you help us this day to voice our complaints in a way that invites you into our healing? I pray these things in the name of Jesus. Amen.